The ballroom went silent as Alexander Hayes lowered the microphone, his voice cold, precise. Some people shouldn't be mothers. Every eye turned to Sophie Bennett, standing there in a simple dress, a little boy clutching her hand, his sneakers worn, his grip tight. She didn't argue. She just knelt, wiped the child's tears, and whispered something only he could hear. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because later that night, Alexander pulled her file, expecting fraud, expecting manipulation. Instead, he found hospital records, a death certificate, and a legal petition she couldn't afford to file. The boy wasn't hers, not by blood. She had dropped out of college, taken 2 jobs, fought a broken system just to keep him from being taken away. And the worst part? The boy had written one line in crayon across the file. "Please don't take my Sophie." Alexander stared at it, his chest tightening, realizing the woman he humiliated in front of the world might be the only real mother that child had ever known, and he was the one about to destroy it. Some people shouldn't be mothers. The words cut through the soft hum of the ballroom like glass shattering on marble, and for a moment, even the string quartet seemed to lose its rhythm as hundreds of eyes turned toward the young woman standing near the back, her fingers wrapped protectively around the small hand of a boy no older than 5, his worn sneakers peeking out beneath the hem of his oversized jeans, while Alexander Hayes, billionaire, CEO, and the man everyone in that room had come to impress, stood tall beneath the chandelier light, his tailored suit flawless, his expression colder than the champagne and crystal flutes, and he didn't look away, not even for a second, because in his mind, he was right. He had built an empire on judgment, on reading people in seconds, on never being fooled by appearances, and what he saw in front of him was a young girl playing a role she had no right to play, a child raising a child. Irresponsibility dressed up as sympathy, and he had no patience for it, not after everything he had seen, not after the years he spent watching broken systems fail kids who deserved better, not after promising himself he would never let emotion cloud his decisions again. But Sophie Bennett didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or try to defend herself in front of the crowd. Instead, she lowered herself slowly to the boy's level, brushing a strand of hair from his face with a gentleness that didn't belong in a room filled with power and money, whispering something that made the boy's trembling shoulders ease just a little, and that small, quiet moment should have been invisible, lost in the noise of judgment, but it wasn't, not to Alexander, because something about it didn't match the story he had already decided was true, and still, he turned away, dismissing it as instinct, as manipulation, as something he had seen before. Yet hours later, long after the gala lights dimmed and the applause faded into memory, he sat alone in his penthouse office overlooking the city, the skyline stretching for miles like something he owned, yet his attention locked on a thin file resting on his desk, her name printed neatly across the top, Sophie Bennett, and he opened it expecting confirmation, expecting proof that he had been right. But the first page wasn't what he anticipated, and neither was the second, because instead of carelessness, he found records, hospital documents, legal forms half completed, notices stamped with deadlines she couldn't meet, and a pattern began to emerge, not of failure, but of sacrifice, of someone holding on longer than anyone should have to. And then there was the detail that made his fingers pause against the paper, the boy's name listed, without hers beside it. No biological connection, no legal claim, nothing that explained why she stayed, and yet she did, and the deeper he looked, the more the story unraveled, until the version of her he had condemned in front of an entire room no longer made sense. And for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes felt something unfamiliar press against the certainty he had always relied on, a quiet, unsettling question he couldn't ignore. What if he had just judged the one person who was actually doing everything right? And as the city lights flickered outside his window, reflecting faintly in the glass, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the file like it might answer him, not realizing that this was only the beginning of a truth that would change far more than his opinion. It would challenge everything he believed about worth, about family, and about what it really meant to deserve the title of mother. Alexander did not sleep that night, not because of the city noise below or the endless notifications lighting up his phone, but because every time he closed his eyes, he saw that moment again, the way Sophie had knelt in front of the boy without hesitation, The way her voice had softened in a room that only respected power, and it unsettled him in a way he could not explain. So by morning, he made a decision he rarely made. He stepped outside his usual routine and went looking for her himself. No assistance, no formal calls, just an address pulled from the file and a quiet drive across parts of the city he had not visited in years, where the sidewalks were cracked and the storefronts carried more stories than profit. And when he finally found the small daycare center listed under her name, it was nothing like the polished institutions he funded. The paint on the sign was slightly faded, the windows decorated with children's drawings taped unevenly, and inside, the air carried a mix of crayons, coffee, and something warmer, something real. And he paused at the entrance longer than he expected, watching through the glass as Sophie moved through the room, not like someone performing for attention, but like someone who belonged there, tying a child's shoelace, lifting another onto a chair, laughing softly when a block tower collapsed, and the boy from the gala was there too, sitting at a small table, carefully coloring with a focus that seemed far older than his age. And when Sophie walked over, he looked up at her not with fear or obligation, but with trust, the kind that could not be faked, and Alexander felt that same quiet pressure in his chest tighten just a little more. Yet when he stepped inside, the room shifted, conversation slowed, and Sophie straightened, her expression guarded now, not surprised, just prepared, as if she had already expected that someone like him would follow. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled with everything left unsaid from the night before, until Alexander finally broke the silence, his voice controlled but no longer sharp, asking a question he had not planned. Why? And she held his gaze without flinching, glancing briefly at the boy before answering in a tone that carried no apology, because someone had to, and it was not dramatic, not defensive, just simple truth. And that answer lingered longer than any argument could have, but Alexander was not ready to accept it, not yet. So he pressed further, mentioning the legal notices, the incomplete forms, the lack of official guardianship, expecting resistance, expecting cracks. But Sophie only sighed quietly, the kind of sound that came from exhaustion rather than fear, and told him that the system did not move fast enough for children who needed someone now, not later, and that sometimes doing the right thing did not come with permission. And as she spoke, the boy slid his drawing across the table toward her, a page filled with uneven lines and bright colors, two figures holding hands beneath a crooked sun, and above them, written in careful letters, was a single word: home. And Sophie smiled in a way that softened everything about her, thanking him as if it were the most important thing she would receive all day. And Alexander stood there, silent, realizing that whatever story he had constructed about her was starting to fall apart piece by piece. Yet the question that replaced it was far more difficult to answer. If she was not who he thought she was, then what had he really done the night before? And more importantly, how far had his judgment already gone in a direction he could not undo? Alexander did not leave right away. Even after the children returned to their routines, and the room slowly filled with the quiet rhythm of crayons on paper and soft laughter, he remained near the doorway, watching something he could not quite name, because what unsettled him was not just Sophie. It was the way everything here functioned without pretense, without the polished structure he was used to controlling, and yet it worked, not perfectly, but honestly, and that honesty pressed against him in a way numbers and reports never had. So instead of walking away, he asked another question, one that came out more personal than he intended. How long? And Sophie glanced at the clock on the wall before answering. Almost 3 years, and that number lingered, heavier than it should have been, because 3 years was not temporary. It was not impulsive. It was commitment, and before he could stop himself, he asked about the boy. And this time Sophie hesitated, not out of fear, but out of careful choice, as if deciding how much of the truth he deserved. And when she spoke, her voice softened just enough to reveal something deeper beneath her calm. His name is Noah. And that was all she said at first, but it was enough to shift something inside Alexander, because the file had mentioned that name only once, buried in a report he had skimmed too quickly, and now it carried weight. And when Sophie finally continued, she explained that Noah had been left in a system that promised stability but delivered uncertainty, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to belong anywhere. and she had stepped in when no one else stayed long enough to notice what he needed, not just a roof or meals, but consistency, someone who showed up every single day. And as she spoke, Noah looked up again, as if he could feel the attention on him. And without hesitation, he stood and walked over to Sophie, pressing his small hand into hers, not asking for permission, just assuming it would be there. And she did not look down. She simply adjusted her stance to make space for him, a movement so natural it barely registered. But to Alexander, it was impossible to ignore, because it contradicted everything he believed about what made someone qualified to care for a child. And yet the part that unsettled him the most was not what he saw. It was what he remembered, fragments of his own childhood surfacing in ways he had spent years avoiding. The sterile offices, the unfamiliar faces, the quiet understanding that no one stayed long enough to matter. And for the first time, the connection between those memories and the present moment became impossible to deny. But instead of admitting it, he shifted back into control, asking about the legal situation, about the risk she was taking without official guardianship. And Sophie's expression tightened slightly, not defensive, just tired, as she explained that every application required resources she did not have, time she could not afford to lose, and decisions made by people who had never met Noah. And still, she kept going, because stopping was not an option. And as she spoke, Alexander noticed the bracelet on Noah's wrist, small, worn, with faded letters spelling out something he could not fully read from where he stood. But Sophie noticed his gaze and gently turned Noah's arm, so the light caught it just right, revealing the words clearly, "Stay with me." And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because that simple phrase carried more weight than any legal document ever could. And Alexander felt the last pieces of his certainty begin to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make him realize that whatever decision he made next would not just affect Sophie. It would define the kind of man he chose to be moving forward. Alexander did not touch the bracelet, but the words stayed with him long after he stepped out of the daycare, echoing in a way that refused to fade. Stay with me. Simple, almost fragile, yet heavier than any contract he had ever signed. And as he walked back to his car, the city felt different, not quieter, not slower, just sharper, as if every detail demanded his attention in a way it never had before. And for the first time in years, he did not check his phone, did not return the calls, waiting for him, because his mind was elsewhere, replaying everything he had seen, everything he had said, and more importantly, everything he had assumed without question. And that realization followed him all the way back to his office, where the walls of glass and steel suddenly felt less like power and more like distance from people like Sophie, from realities he had long decided were not his concern, yet now they were, whether he wanted them to be or not. And he found himself standing at the window, looking out over a city he thought he understood, until a quiet knock pulled him back, his assistant stepping in with a folder he had not requested, a follow-up report on Sophie Bennett, more detailed, more complete. And this time, he did not skim. He read every line, slowly, carefully, because now he needed to know, not to confirm his judgment, but to challenge it. And what he found did not come as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady unfolding of truth. Sophie had no financial safety net, no influential connections, no backup plan, just part-time jobs, long hours, and a pattern of consistent presence in Noah's life that stretched back further than any temporary arrangement should have. And then there was the detail that shifted everything. A legal notice scheduled within days, a hearing that could determine whether Noah would be moved again, relocated to another placement, another unfamiliar space, another reset. And Alexander felt that same tightening in his chest. But this time it came with urgency, because this was no longer about what he believed, it was about what would happen next. And without fully deciding why, he reached for his phone, canceling meetings, redirecting his schedule, making space for something he had never prioritized before, involvement, not as a donor, not as a distant figure writing checks, but as someone stepping into a situation he did not fully control. And when he arrived at the courthouse days later, the atmosphere was nothing like his world of boardrooms and negotiations. There were no polished speeches, no strategic positioning, just people waiting, hoping, holding on to outcomes they could not guarantee. And across the room, he saw Sophie again, seated quietly beside Noah, her posture steady, her expression calm but focused, as if she had prepared for this moment alone, and when she noticed him, there was no relief, no expectation, just acknowledgement, because she had never asked for his help, and that fact settled heavily as he approached, realizing that whatever he chose to do next would not be about proving himself right or wrong. It would be about deciding whether he was willing to stand beside someone who had already been standing alone far longer than anyone should have to. And as the doors to the courtroom opened, the weight of that decision followed him inside, no longer avoidable, no longer distant, but real, immediate, and impossible to ignore. The courtroom was smaller than Alexander expected, not in size but in presence, because nothing here was designed to impress. There were no polished speeches or carefully curated images, just quiet tension, paperwork stacked in uneven piles, and people holding on to outcomes that could change everything in a matter of minutes. And as he took a seat a few rows behind Sophie, he noticed how still she was, her hand resting gently over Noah's, her thumb moving in slow, reassuring circles as if she was the one calming him when it was clear she carried just as much weight inside. And Noah sat close, his small frame leaning slightly toward her, not out of fear, but habit, the kind that forms when someone has become your constant. And Alexander watched that detail more closely than anything else, because it was not forced, not performative, it was instinct. And when the case was called, Sophie stood, her posture straight but not rigid, her voice steady as she answered each question with clarity, not trying to impress, just trying to be understood, explaining how long she had cared for Noah, how she had arranged her life around his needs, how every decision she made had been shaped by one goal, to give him stability. And as she spoke, Alexander could see the contrast unfolding in real time. On one side, the system, structured, procedural, distant, and on the other, a single person doing everything she could with what little she had. And it was not perfect, it was not supported by wealth or influence, but it was consistent, and that consistency was something no document could fully capture. And when the opposing side raised concerns, mentioning her age, her lack of financial resources, the uncertainty of her position, Alexander felt something shift again, because those were the same points he had used in his own judgment, the same reasons he had spoken with such certainty that night. And now, hearing them repeated in a room where the outcome would carry real consequences, they no longer felt like facts, they felt incomplete. And he glanced at Noah, who sat quietly, his fingers tightening slightly around Sophie's sleeve, not interrupting, not speaking, just holding on. And that single gesture carried more meaning than any argument being presented. And without fully planning it, Alexander stood, the movement subtle but enough to draw attention, and for a brief moment, the room shifted toward him, recognition passing through a few faces, but he did not step forward, he did not interrupt, he simply remained standing, as if reminding himself that this moment was not about control, it was about choice. And when Sophie finished speaking, there was a pause, a space where the next voice would shape what came next, and Alexander felt the weight of every assumption he had made pressing against that silence, because now he understood that staying silent would be its own kind of decision. And as the judge prepared to move forward, he took a breath, steady but deliberate, realizing that for the first time in a long time, what he said next would not be calculated for advantage. It would be measured by something far more difficult, whether he was willing to stand for the truth he had only just begun to see. The silence stretched just long enough to feel heavy, and then Alexander stepped forward, not with the commanding presence that usually filled boardrooms, but with something quieter, something more deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the sharp certainty it once had, only clarity shaped by what he had learned. "Your Honor," he began, requesting permission to address the court, and when granted, he did not look at the judge first. He looked at Sophie, just for a moment, as if acknowledging that this was not his story to control. Then he turned forward, explaining that he had reviewed the case personally, that he had seen the documentation, but more importantly, that he had witnessed something no report could fully capture: consistency, presence, and a level of commitment that did not come from obligation but from choice. And as he spoke, the room shifted, not dramatically, but enough that attention settled on him differently now, because this was not a man making a donation or offering a surface-level endorsement. This was someone placing his credibility behind something intangible, and he continued, carefully, stating that while financial stability was often considered a measure of suitability, it did not account for the kind of environment a child truly needed, and that removing Noah from the one person who had provided him with consistent care for years could create a disruption far greater than the risks being discussed. And Sophie stood still, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, not from doubt, but from the unfamiliar experience of someone else carrying part of the weight she had held alone for so long. And Noah, though he did not fully understand the words being spoken, seemed to sense the shift, his grip on Sophie's hand easing slightly as he looked toward Alexander with a quiet curiosity. And when Alexander finished, he did not add anything more. He did not overstate, did not try to persuade. Beyond what was true, he simply stepped back, allowing the moment to settle on its own. And for the first time since entering that room, he felt something different replace the need to control the outcome, a willingness to accept whatever decision came, because now it would be based on a fuller understanding than the one he had brought with him. And as the judge reviewed the information, the room fell into a stillness that felt almost suspended, every second stretching longer than it should, until finally, the decision was announced, not final, not absolute, but enough to shift everything, a continuation, an opportunity for Sophie to complete the necessary steps with support, rather than an immediate separation, and the release of tension was almost invisible, but it was there, in the way Sophie exhaled just slightly, in the way Noah leaned closer to her without fear, and Alexander remained where he was, not stepping forward, not interrupting, because this was not a victory he could claim, it was simply a moment where the direction had changed, and as people began to move, as quiet conversations resumed, and the weight of uncertainty eased just enough to allow hope back in, Alexander realized that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he had never intended to be part of, and yet now could not walk away from, because the truth he had uncovered did not just change how he saw Sophie. It changed how he saw responsibility itself, not as something measured by status or resources, but by the willingness to stay, even when no one was watching, even when it would have been easier to leave. And as he turned toward the exit, he knew that whatever came next would require more than words. It would require action, the kind that could not be undone or ignored, and for the first time, he was ready to take it. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter in a way that did not erase what had happened but softened its edges, and Sophie stepped down the stone steps slowly, Noah's hand still in hers, his small fingers wrapped with the same quiet certainty as before, while people moved around them, conversations picking up, cars passing, life continuing without pause. Yet for Sophie, everything still felt suspended, as if the ground beneath her had not fully settled. And when Alexander approached, he did not close the distance immediately. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space she had never asked for but clearly deserved. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because what had happened inside that room could not be undone with a simple sentence. And Sophie was the first to break the silence, her voice calm but measured, asking him why, not in accusation, not in gratitude, just in honest curiosity. And Alexander held that question longer than he expected, because for the first time, he did not have a prepared answer, no strategic reasoning, no calculated explanation, just the truth. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet weight, because I was wrong, and the words were simple, but they did not come easily, and Sophie studied him for a moment, not searching for sincerity, but recognizing it when she saw it, and she nodded slightly, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement, because trust was not something that returned in a single moment, and Alexander understood that without needing it explained, so he did not push further. Instead, he shifted the conversation, mentioning the hearing, the next steps, the support she would need, and Sophie listened. But there was a subtle resistance in her posture, not rejecting his help, but not fully accepting it either, because for years, she had learned to rely on herself, to move forward without expecting anyone to stay. And changing that pattern was not something that happened overnight. And Noah, who had been quiet, looked up at Alexander again, his expression thoughtful, almost as if he was trying to understand where this man now fit into the world he knew. And without hesitation, He reached into his pocket and pulled out the same folded piece of paper he had drawn earlier, holding it up toward Alexander with a small, tentative gesture, and Alexander paused before taking it, careful, as if the paper carried more weight than it appeared, and when he opened it, he saw the same uneven lines, the same bright colors, but this time, there were 3 figures instead of 2, standing beneath that crooked sun, and for a second, he did not move, because the implication was not lost on him, and Sophie noticed it too, her expression shifting just slightly, not surprised, but aware of what that simple drawing meant, and Alexander looked back at Noah, then at Sophie, and something settled in that moment, not a promise spoken out loud, but a decision forming quietly, and when he handed the drawing back, he did not step away. He remained where he was, no longer as an outsider observing from a distance, but as someone choosing, for the first time, to be part of something that could not be controlled, only supported, and as they stood there, the city continuing around them, the next chapter of their lives did not begin with certainty or ease. It began with something far more fragile, a willingness to try, and that, Alexander realized, was where real change always started. Days passed not with dramatic change, but with quiet shifts that slowly rewrote the rhythm of their lives, and Alexander found himself returning to places he once would have overlooked, the daycare, the small apartment building on the corner where Sophie lived, even the narrow streets filled with everyday struggles that no longer felt distant to him. And he did not arrive with grand gestures or announcements. He showed up with consistency, the same way Sophie had, bringing groceries one afternoon without making it seem like charity, sitting at a tiny table helping Noah with a puzzle that had missing pieces, listening more than speaking as Sophie navigated paperwork spread across her kitchen counter, and each time, she watched him carefully, not suspicious, but aware that presence meant more than promises, and Alexander understood that without needing it explained, because for the first time, he was not trying to prove something. He was trying to learn what staying actually required. And there were moments when the difference between their worlds surfaced clearly, like when he suggested solutions that came from resources she did not have, or when she gently corrected him, reminding him that systems did not change overnight just because someone powerful stepped in, and instead of resisting, he adjusted, slowly, intentionally, allowing himself to see things from a perspective he had never needed to consider before, and Noah, in his quiet way, became the bridge between them, asking simple questions that carried unexpected weight, like why Alexander wore suits all the time or whether he knew how to fix a broken toy truck, and Alexander, who could negotiate million-dollar deals without hesitation, found himself kneeling on the floor, trying to align small plastic pieces, realizing that this kind of problem-solving required patience rather than control. And Sophie watched those moments with a subtle shift in her expression, not fully trust yet, but something closer to openness. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and the city softened into that brief golden hour, they sat together on the worn steps outside her building, Noah resting against her shoulder, half asleep, and Alexander broke the quiet with a question that had been forming over days, asking what she needed, not in a general sense, but specifically, realistically, and Sophie took her time answering, because for years, no one had asked in a way that expected a real response, and when she finally spoke, she did not ask for money or shortcuts. She asked for stability, for guidance through a system that often felt impossible to navigate alone, for someone who would not disappear when things became complicated, and Alexander listened without interruption, because this was not a negotiation, it was understanding, and as she finished, the weight of her words settled between them, clear, unembellished, and real, and for the first time, he responded not as a businessman offering solutions, but as someone making a choice, telling her that he would not promise perfection, but he would promise to stay, and Sophie looked at him, really looked this time, measuring not the words but the intention behind them, and though she did not respond immediately, the silence that followed felt different, less guarded, more open, and Noah stirred slightly, his small hand reaching out instinctively, brushing against both of them, connecting them in a way that did not need explanation. And in that quiet moment, Alexander understood that what they were building was not something defined by titles or expectations. It was something far simpler and far more difficult, trust formed over time, shaped by actions, and strengthened by the decision to remain, even when it would have been easier not to. The final hearing came on a quiet morning that felt almost ordinary, the kind of day where nothing in the air suggested that lives could shift direction before noon. And yet as Sophie walked up the courthouse steps with Noah beside her, his small hand wrapped securely around hers, she felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle in her chest, not overwhelming, but present, a reminder of everything she had carried to reach this point. And Alexander followed just a step behind, not leading, not taking over, simply there, the same way he had been every day since that first moment he chose to stay. And inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was steadier this time, less tense, more resolved, as if the space itself recognized that something had already begun to change. And when Sophie stood to speak, her voice carried the same quiet strength, but now it was supported, not replaced, by the presence beside her. And Alexander did not interrupt, did not speak unless asked, but when he did, his words were measured, grounded not in authority but in observation, describing what he had witnessed over weeks, the consistency, the care, the environment Sophie had created not with resources but with intention. And this time, the narrative was different, no longer built on assumptions, but on lived experience. And as the judge listened, reviewing the additional documentation, the completed steps, the support now in place, the decision that followed did not come as a dramatic announcement, but as something quieter, something more meaningful: approval, recognition, permanence. And for a moment, the room seemed to pause, as if allowing that word to settle fully before moving forward. And Sophie exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried for so long finally releasing in a way she did not need to show outwardly, because the change was internal, steady, real. And Noah looked up at her, searching her face, and when she nodded, just slightly, he smiled. A small, certain smile that did not need to be bigger to carry everything it meant. And as they stepped outside again, the same city moved around them, unchanged yet completely different, because now, what they had built was no longer fragile or temporary. It was theirs to keep. And Alexander stood with them, not at the center, not claiming credit, but present. And as Noah reached for both of their hands without hesitation, connecting them in a way that felt natural now rather than new, Alexander understood something he had spent years overlooking: that worth was never defined by status or approval. It was defined by the willingness to stay, to choose again and again, even when it was difficult, even when no one was watching. And as the sunlight settled over the street, soft and steady, he realized that the judgment he had once spoken so easily had been replaced by something far more lasting: respect. And in that quiet moment, without needing to say it out loud, all three of them stepped forward together, not into a perfect future, but into one they would build, day by day, the only way that ever truly mattered.